Christmas lights were still flickering on the porch when my son opened the door. The kind of warm gold that makes any house look gentler than it is. I stepped inside with the dish I made every year for him, the one his mother taught me before she died. Steam rose into the air. Nobody reached for it. From the living room, I could see my grandson sitting beside a stack of untouched toys, pushing a truck back and forth without a sound. The tree was perfect. The table was perfect. Every detail staged like a catalog photo, except for the empty space where my name card should have been. They set a folding chair at the end instead. Conversations floated past me about bonuses and remodels and market returns. I could feel my son trying to pull me in and feel everyone else gently pushing me out. Then she did not even look up from her wine glass before saying it. "What do you even have?" It hit the room harder than the sound of the spoon she set down beside her plate. Her parents lowered their voices. My son froze. Even the kid stopped rolling his truck. I thought of everything I could say. The years I carried this family through sickness and debt. The nights I slept in hospital chairs. The childhood I built with my bare hands for the man sitting 3 seats away. But I said nothing. And somehow that silence told her she was right. What none of them knew was this. A signature that was not mine was already moving through someone's hands. A cabin in Minnesota was waiting, and a will written years ago was about to make every person at that table rethink what a man like me might have. They thought the night ended with that question. It didn't. It started with it. And the will answered in a way none of them saw coming. The scalloped potatoes were still warm in my hands when Michael opened the door. The house behind him glowed with soft gold light, the kind that makes every corner look cleaner and richer than it is. Snow clung to my boots and melted in small drops on the dark blue welcome mat. He stepped aside with a smile that came and went too quickly. I could tell he was glad I came, but also hoping I would not stay long enough to make things complicated. I walked in, and the warmth hit me at once, a mixture of cinnamon oven heat and the kind of scented candle chosen by people who never check the price before buying. Their Christmas tree reached almost to the ceiling, covered in matching ornaments that made the whole room look staged. I remembered the years when Michael used to hang crooked paper stars on a short tree his mother picked out. Those memories rose up without warning, soft around the edges, carrying the weight of everything time had taken. Emily appeared moving fast in a red dress that shimmered when she turned. She said my name like it was the last item on a list. Her eyes went to the dish in my hands, then flicked away. She lifted the foil corner, and steam drifted up, smelling like holidays that belonged to another life. She did not say the potatoes looked good. She only said she would find a place for them, then moved toward the kitchen, without waiting for me to follow. I walked through the living room and saw toys that were neatly arranged, almost untouched. My grandson sat with a plastic truck, but barely pushed it. He looked up at me with that open curiosity kids have when they see someone who belongs to their world, but rarely appears in it. I smiled and gave a small wave. He smiled back. It loosened something inside me that had been tight since I stepped through the door. Dinner was already underway when we sat. The table was long and set with name cards written in careful handwriting. Mine was not there. A plate had been placed at the end, where a folding chair waited. Nobody mentioned it, and I pretended not to notice. Years teach a man which small humiliations can be swallowed without choking. Emily's parents talked about their plans for spring and a renovation they were considering. Their voices floated above the table like they were narrating a life I had never lived. Michael tried to bring me into the conversation. He mentioned my shop, the weather, a football game. Each attempt slipped away as quickly as it came. I answered when I had to, then went quiet again. For a moment I watched Michael watching them. I saw him nod at the right time, smile when expected. Somewhere in that pattern of polite gestures was the boy who once held my hand, crossing icy driveways, the same kid who used to fall asleep on my shoulder after long days in the snow. That boy had grown into a man who lived in a world built of different materials than mine. Sleek, polished, unforgiving. Dessert came and went. My potatoes never reached the table. When the dishes were cleared, we all sat back while Emily refilled glasses. She talked about investments and equity, and how their house had appreciated more than they expected. Her father praised their timing. Her mother called it smart planning. Each compliment felt like a quiet announcement that everyone at that table had contributed something real to the success of this home. Then Emily looked at me. Not long. Just long enough to place me in a different category than the rest. She said with a small smile that everyone here had something to offer. Her father had his business. Her mother had her foundation work. Michael had his career. Even she had her projects and investments. She let the words settle, then tipped her head in my direction. And what do you have? The room stilled. Forks lowered. Even the television in the next room seemed to fade. Her voice had not been cruel, only careless. In some ways, that made it worse. I could have spoken about the years I worked 2 jobs, so Michael could attend the school he wanted. I could have reminded them of the down payment, the late-night calls, the hospital hallways, where I sat alone through Linda's final months. Every sacrifice I had made was there on the tip of my tongue, sharp enough to cut. But the weight of the moment pressed it all back down. Nothing I said. The words settled in the air like ash. Michael shifted in his seat. His mother-in-law gave a soft laugh. Conversation resumed thin and awkward like a curtain pulled over a crack in the wall. I sat through the rest of it without speaking. The potatoes remained on the counter near the sink. Later, when I stepped toward the front door to put my boots back on, voices rose behind me from the kitchen. Emily's parents were speaking in low tones. They did not know I was close enough to hear. He has nothing. No assets that touch ours. No risk to the family wealth. Good. Then we have nothing to worry about. Their certainty hit harder than any insult. It was not anger, just dismissal. The kind of quiet sorting people do when they decide who matters and who does not. I stepped outside into the cold. The snow had thickened and each breath came out in pale smoke. Across the street, a line of Christmas lights flickered on the gutters of a neighboring house. Inside Michael's windows, warm shadows moved blurred by the glass. I walked down the sidewalk until I could no longer hear the sounds from the party. The air was sharp and honest, and it cleared my head more than any words ever could. Somewhere far behind me, people I loved were finishing their Christmas night without me. And I stood there alone with a single thought rising from a place inside me I had not visited in years. A man does not lose his worth just because others fail to see it. Sometimes silence is not surrender. Sometimes it is the first step toward remembering what still belongs to him. And I had the feeling that something long buried in my past was waiting to remind me of exactly that. The furnace had settled into its steady winter hum by the time I stepped inside the house. I shut the door behind me and the latch clicked through the quiet in a way that made the place feel even more empty. Snow still clung to the bottoms of my jeans. It melted into small, dark patches on the floor as I walked toward the living room. The lamp near the fireplace lit the room with a soft, familiar glow, and the first thing my eyes found was the rocking chair. Linda's chair. It waited where it always waited, angled slightly toward the firebox, as if she might return at any moment and settle into it. I dropped my keys into the bowl on the entry table and heard the faint echo of metal on ceramic. In the stillness of that house, the sound felt louder than it should. I went to the chair and touched the top of the backrest. The wood had worn smooth under her hand over the years. Even now it felt warm, though the room was cool. I stood there longer than I meant to, and in the quiet the memories rose without asking or announcing themselves. There had been a time when I thought our life together would stretch farther than any road. In those early years, I had an offer to move to Green Bay for a bigger contracting job. Better pay, bigger shop, bigger future for anyone who measured life by what they owned. I remembered showing Linda the posting folded once set on the table between us, like a secret. I was almost afraid to speak. She looked at it, then looked at me, then looked at Michael, sleeping on the couch with a fever. Sometimes the direction of a life changes in a single moment that barely makes a sound. When Michael started school, I turned the job down. I stayed with the small shop. I stayed with the small house. I stayed for the mornings when he would run out to the truck wearing mismatched gloves and a lopsided grin. What we had in that old rental was not much by the standards of the world, but it held everything we believed mattered. You cannot explain that to people who do not measure worth in the same currency. I moved away from the chair and walked into the hall. The door frame still held the marks where we measured Michael's height year after year. The pencil lines stopped when he turned 12. He grew faster than I could keep up with, and the years after that came at me in a blur. First girlfriends, first heartbreak, first job. Then Linda got sick, and everything I thought I understood collapsed into something smaller and harder and more real. Her side of the closet emptied piece by piece. The soft sweaters went first. Then the dresses. Then the shoes she kept in perfect condition, even though she rarely had a reason to wear them. Some things I could pack into boxes. Others I could not. The rocking chair stayed because I could not imagine a world where it was not there. And the file box in the garage stayed because opening it felt like tearing open a door I had barely managed to close. I pushed the garage door open, and the cold came up from the concrete floor. The overhead bulb flickered to life when I pulled the chain. Dust hung in the air like a thin fog. The workbench held tools arranged the way I had always kept them. A set of chisels I once bought with plans for a furniture line I never had time to build. A heavy-duty router still in its box. I had bought it the summer before Linda got sick, picturing a future where Michael and I would make tables together in the backyard. The box had never been opened. I touched the edge of it and felt the slight give of the cardboard. Every man has one or two things he meant to start, but never did. The router was one of mine. The file box sat on the upper shelf. The tape along the top was yellowed and peeling at the corners. I reached up, pulled it down, and set it on the workbench. The weight of it surprised me. Memory always weighs more than it looks. When I lifted the lid, a faint scent came up, something between paper and perfume and dust. Inside were stacks of documents and cards and envelopes crowded together, like a life pressed into layers. Near the top lay a folded note with my name written on it. I recognized Linda's handwriting immediately. The edges of the paper trembled slightly as I unfolded it. The garage was cold, but my hands were not steady for other reasons. If you are reading this, you are probably alone. I know the way you blame yourself when the world turns hard. If anyone makes you feel small, remember what you have given. You are worth the respect you keep giving to others. I stared at the lines and felt the furnace inside the house kick on again. The hum traveled through the wall like a reminder that the world kept moving, even when the heart lagged behind. I folded the note back into its original creases and set it aside. Beneath the letters were medical papers, insurance claims, receipts from pharmacies and gas stations. They told a story I knew too well. Beneath those, tucked flat against the bottom, was a manila envelope. No writing on the outside. Just a small tear in one corner. I slid it out and felt its uneven weight. Inside were property documents stamped in Minnesota some more than 10 years old. The name printed on them was Thomas Carter, Linda's older brother. I had not seen Tom since before Linda got sick. He lived out near Brainerd in a small cabin he built himself. He wrote letters every Christmas and always added a note for Michael. When Linda died, the letters stopped. I assumed he wanted distance from the grief. Everyone handles loss differently. I held the papers under the bulb. The ink on the tax statements was slightly faded. The land description read mixed woodland and lakeshore. Not prime real estate, at least not when these forms were printed, but solid enough to hold meaning. In the margins, Linda had written reminders to call him and to ask about surveys. She had underlined a sentence where he mentioned something about wanting the land to stay in the family. I tried to remember the last conversation I had with him. It had been brief. He had asked about Michael. He had asked about the treatment options for Linda. He had promised to visit and never did. I had not blamed him at the time. Not everyone can face the dying. Some men cannot stand in rooms where they feel powerless. I put the papers back into the envelope but did not close it. The weight of it rested in my hand, like something waiting to be named. I thought again of the voices in the kitchen earlier, the certainty with which they dismissed me. I thought of Emily's question at the table, the quick twist of her smile, the silence of the room. The furnace clicked off, and the garage fell quiet again. My breath showed in the air when I exhaled. I reached for the light chain, but did not pull it yet. Instead, I stood there, enveloped under my arm, and listened to the stillness settle around me. There were moments in life when a man feels the ground shift long before he sees the cause. This was one of them. I turned toward the door, switched off the light, and let the darkness gather as I stepped back into the house. The envelope pressed lightly against my side with every movement. It felt like a small thing, but small things have a way of changing the course of a life when a man is finally ready to look at them. The morning light came in through the blinds in thin stripes across the kitchen table. I sat there with a cup of coffee that had gone cold before I remembered to drink it. The envelope from the garage lay beside me unopened since the night before, though I had touched it more than once as if the weight of the paper could steady something inside me. The house felt smaller than usual, filled with the quiet of a place that holds more memories than voices. My phone buzzed on the table. Michael's name lit the screen. I let it ring once before answering. His voice sounded careful. There was a pause between his words, a small stiffness I knew too well. "Dad, can you come over for dinner this week?" I asked him what the occasion was. He hesitated before saying that Emily wanted to clear up the misunderstanding from Christmas. He said it like he was reading from a line that had been handed to him. I agreed to come anyway. A father does not turn away from his son even when the words carry a weight that does not feel like his. The evening air was colder when I drove to their house. Snow had gathered in soft piles along the sides of the road, and the streetlights cast long shadows over the drifts. When I stepped onto their porch, warm light spilled through the windows, and I could hear music playing somewhere inside. I knocked and waited. Michael opened the door with the same practiced smile he had used on Christmas. There was tension in his shoulders, the kind that comes from holding something in. He stepped aside and told me they were glad I came. His voice said, "Welcome," but something in his posture said, "Caution." Inside the house looked as perfect as it had before. I walked past the entryway into the dining room, where the table was set for 3. Candles flickered in glass holders. Emily stood at the kitchen counter arranging a plate of appetizers. When she turned, her expression was warm in a way that felt new, almost rehearsed. She greeted me with a softness I had not heard from her before. She asked if I was settling into winter all right, if the shop work was steady, if I had given any thought to long-term plans for my retirement. She said it all with a kind smile, but the questions landed like stones dropped into still water, one after another. Michael pulled out a chair for me. I sat down and watched him as he tried to settle into the moment. He kept glancing toward Emily before answering even the simplest question. He did not seem to notice he was doing it. I noticed every time. Dinner moved slowly. Emily kept steering the conversation toward the future. She talked about stability. She talked about how families did better when finances were organized early. She said it in the tone of someone discussing a business portfolio rather than a life. She asked whether I had considered letting Michael help manage my accounts. She said it with a smile that did not match the pressure in her voice. I cut a piece of chicken and let her words hang. Michael watched me the way a man watches a storm cloud, unsure if it will break or pass. I asked her what brought all this up. She answered quickly, too quickly, that she and Michael were simply trying to build something solid for their family. She placed her hand on Michael's arm as she said it. He nodded, but his eyes stayed on his plate. The room felt warm, warmer than before, and the candles flickered from the air currents moving through the vents. I lifted my water glass and looked across the table at them. There was something tight in the space between them, as if a silent conversation was being held right in front of me. I had seen that look on couples before, the kind where one speaks and the other follows, not out of agreement, but expectation. After dinner, Michael offered to show me a repair he was planning for the basement steps. Emily excused herself to take a phone call. Her voice drifted through the dining room as she walked toward the front door. I followed Michael down the hallway, but before the door closed behind us, I heard her tone shift quieter, sharper, the sound of someone no longer performing. "It will be fine," she said. "He will agree. Just get everything set and make sure Michael handles the rest by March." The words hit harder because they were spoken in confidence meant for someone on the other end of the line, not for me. I stopped halfway down the stairs. Michael looked back at me, unaware of what I had just heard. He lifted the loose stair tread to show me the damage underneath. I nodded, but my mind was no longer on the wood. Outside the basement window, the snow was reflecting the porch light, creating a soft wash of white across the floor. I watched it while Michael explained how he planned to reinforce the steps. His voice faded into the background as my thoughts drifted to Emily's words. March. The deadline had a shape to it, a pressure. It made sense of the sudden warmth in her smile, the careful interest in my future, the way Michael kept looking at hers before answering anything. When he finished talking about the stairs, he asked if something was wrong. His voice sounded small, like a child seeking reassurance. I told him everything looked fine and that I had just been thinking about a project from work. He nodded, relieved to have an answer, even a vague one. We walked back upstairs. Emily had ended her call and was standing near the living room window looking out at the street. She turned as we entered and smiled again. I felt the weight of her gaze resting on me for a moment longer than it should. There was something searching in it, as if she was trying to measure what I knew and what I might be hiding. I thanked them for dinner and reached for my coat. Michael helped me with the sleeves the way he used to do for Linda when her joints ached. It was a small gesture, and for a second I saw the boy he once was, the boy who would climb into my truck with cold hands and warm eyes. The distance between that boy and the man standing in front of me was a distance I could not cross in one night. As I stepped out onto the porch, the cold came up fast, sharper than before. The night was quiet, and the sky held a pale wash of stars. I stood there for a moment, letting the air clear my head. Through the window, I saw Emily place a hand on Michael's shoulder. He leaned toward her without thinking, the way a man leans when he is already pulled into someone else's current. I walked to my truck and started the engine. The headlights cast long white beams across the snow. I sat there without shifting into gear, watching the house through the windshield. The porch light glowed on the steps. A faint shadow moved behind the curtains. Something had changed inside that house. I could feel it in the silence between their words, in the practiced ease of Emily's smile, in the way Michael kept searching her face before finding his own voice. Whatever they were planning, it had a timeline, and somehow I was part of it. I eased the gear into drive and pulled away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, the house grew smaller, then disappeared behind a row of bare trees. The road ahead stretched quiet and empty, lit only by my headlights and the distant signs along the highway. The envelope on the passenger seat slid a little as I turned. I steadied it with my hand. A small movement, but enough to remind me that not everything in this story belonged to them. The snow fell in slow patterns across the hood of the truck. I kept driving the engine steady beneath me, the night pressing close around the windows, and a sense rising in my chest that the ground was shifting again in ways I could not yet see. The snowbanks along my street had turned gray at the edges by the time the new year settled in. Days slid into each other. I spent them fixing broken cabinet doors, tightening loose railings, pretending that the envelope from Minnesota on my kitchen table was just another bill waiting to be paid. One morning in early January, the phone rang while I was sanding a piece of oak in the garage. The vibration on the workbench made the chisel handles rattle. I wiped my hands on a rag and answered without checking the caller. The voice on the other end belonged to Sam Keller, the lawyer who had handled Linda's parents' estate years ago. I had not heard from him since the week we buried her mother. Hearing him now pulled me back in time in a way that made the room feel smaller. He did not speak in small talk. Lawyers usually do not when the news is not good. Edward. He said, "I am calling about Thomas Carter." I leaned against the bench. The name took a second to land. "Is he all right?" I asked. There was a pause on the line. The kind of pause where a man draws in breath and chooses his words. "I am afraid he passed a few days ago. Heart failure. He had my firm on retainer, and he named you as an interested party. There will be a meeting next week in Brainerd regarding his will. I would strongly advise that you attend. The word will sat there between us." My hand tightened around the edge of the workbench. I told him I would be there. He gave me a date and time and an address on a street I did not recognize. When the call ended, the garage settled back into its usual hum, but my thoughts had already moved north. The drive to Minnesota took most of the morning. The interstate stretched out in long, straight lines under a pale sky. The landscape changed slowly, farmhouses giving way to more trees, then more open land again. The farther north I went, the colder the air seemed to grow, even inside the truck. By the time I reached the outskirts of Brainerd, the sun sat low and white behind a thin layer of clouds. I did not go straight to the address Sam had given me. Instead, I followed the smaller roads that my memory traced from Linda's stories, letting instinct and half-remembered directions pull me along. The cabin appeared the way forgotten places do all at once. One moment there was only forest, the next, there was a break in the trees and a narrow drive leading to a clearing. The building stood with its back to a frozen lake, smoke no longer rising from its chimney. Snow piled up against the steps. No tracks broke the surface. It looked like a postcard of solitude. I parked near the edge of the clearing and sat for a moment, engine idling. This was the place Linda spoke about on summer nights when we could not sleep. The place where she learned to fish. Where she and Tom had spent whole weeks without seeing anyone else. Seeing it now without her and without him made something in my chest fold in on itself. I did not get out of the truck. There are some thresholds a man knows better than to cross when he is not invited. I sat long enough to feel the weight of the silence, then put the truck in gear and turned back toward town. Sam's office was on the second floor of a brick building on a street lined with bare trees and diagonal parking spaces. A small plaque beside the door listed his name and two associates in neat brass letters. Inside, the warmth smelled like coffee and old paper. The receptionist looked up and asked for my name. When I gave it, she nodded, as if that confirmed something, and motioned to the row of chairs along the wall. "You can have a seat," she said. "Mr. Keller will be with you shortly." There was one other person in the waiting area. Emily. She sat in the chair nearest the door to Sam's office, her legs crossed, phone in hand. She wore a dark coat and boots with a heel that clicked softly when she shifted her position. Seeing her there knocked the air out of me for a second. She looked up, surprise flickering across her face before she smoothed it away. "Edward," she said. "I did not know you would be here already." I took the chair furthest from her. The room was not big, but it felt important to leave those few empty seats between us. I asked how she knew Thomas had passed. She answered quickly, almost too casually. "Michael got a call from someone at the firm. He could not get away from work on such short notice, so he asked me to come, just to keep an eye on anything that might affect the family." She said family the way people say asset. Her eyes slid toward the closed office door, then back to her phone. Her thumb tapped the screen, though it did not look like she was really reading anything. There was a coat rack by the window. I watched a drop of melted snow fall from my sleeve onto the wooden floor. Outside, small flurries drifted past the glass, catching in the corners of the panes. The office door opened, and Sam stepped out. He had gray at his temples that I did not remember, and his glasses sat lower on his nose. He shook my hand, first asked how I was holding up, then nodded politely at Emily when I introduced her as my daughter-in-law. He did not seem surprised she was there. Lawyers see all kinds of people show up when wills are involved. He led us into a smaller conference room. A long table sat in the center with 3 chairs on one side and a single chair on the other. A folder and a thick envelope rested at the far end. The fluorescent lights made everything look flatter and sharper. We took our seats. Emily leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped on the table. Sam cleared his throat and flipped open the folder. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to express my condolences. Thomas spoke often of you, Edward. He was a very private man, but he was clear about his wishes." He picked up the envelope, tore it open, and removed a few typed pages. The sound of the paper sliding out echoed in the small room. My heart thudded once hard, then seemed to wait. Sam began to read. The language was formal, at first the standard legal phrases about sound, mind, and last wishes. Then he reached the part that mattered. "Regarding my property and assets, I, Thomas Carter, being of sound mind, do hereby leave my estate, including all real property and liquid holdings, to my brother-in-law, Edward Miller of Appleton, Wisconsin." He continued listing the details. The cabin and the 40 acres of woodland, the bank accounts attached to the property, a modest investment portfolio I had not known existed. Each item landed like a quiet strike on an anvil. Beside me, Emily went still. I did not look at her, but I could feel the change. The slight tightening in her posture, the way her breath halted just long enough to be heard if you were listening for it. Sam read a final line. It was handwritten at the bottom of the typed page. "I am leaving these things to Edward because he is the only one who never asked me for anything. He showed me respect when he had nothing to gain. I expect nothing in return, only that he decide their future with the same integrity." The room fell silent. I sat there, hands folded on the table, staring at the grain of the wood. I had not known Tom saw me that way. Our conversations had always been brief, practical. I had helped him fix a leaky roof once, driven up in an old truck with a ladder strapped to the top. We had shared a beer on the porch afterward, talked about nothing important. I did not think men measured each other in those moments, but apparently they do. Sam asked if I had any questions. My mouth felt dry. I shook my head. Emily spoke instead. Her voice was lighter than her face. So everything goes to Edward. Sam confirmed it. She tried to phrase another question, something about whether Michael was mentioned anywhere, whether there were any contingencies, but the answer stayed the same. The estate belonged to me. What I did with it was my choice. We left the room with copies of the documents in a white envelope. In the hallway, Emily's composure had cracks running through it. The color had drained from her cheeks, and her fingers gripped the strap of her purse until the knuckles turned pale. She stopped near the door and turned to me. "Well," she said, "at least it is good news for you." Good news. The words sat wrong in my ears. There was a man buried in frozen ground somewhere near here. A man who had carried his own loneliness in a cabin by a lake. A man I had not visited in years. Inheriting what he left behind did not feel like good news. It felt like responsibility. I stepped outside into the cold. The sky over Brainerd was a flat silver, no hint of sun. My breath rose in white puffs. Across the street, the snow along the curb had been pushed into rough piles by plows. Cars moved slowly, tires crunching over ice. Behind me, the door opened and closed again. I heard the quick tap of Emily's heels as she walked past to her car. She unlocked it with a soft chirp and sat inside for a moment, phone pressed to her ear, face turned away. Even from that distance, I could see the tension in her shoulders. I held the envelope tighter under my arm. The words from Christmas floated up in my mind, soft and clear. "What do you even have?" I had answered with nothing because it was the simplest way to end a moment that was already broken. Standing on that sidewalk with a stranger's estate in my hands, I understood how quickly the meaning of that answer was changing in other people's eyes. A gust of wind came down the street, lifting loose flakes from the snowbanks and sending them swirling around my boots. I lowered my head against the cold and walked toward my truck, the envelope pressing against my side, heavier now than when I first picked it up. Word travels fast in a town like Appleton, faster than you think it should. By the time I made it back from Brainerd, the snow on my truck had not even melted, and people were already talking. A man inherits a cabin and 40 acres in Minnesota, and the story grows with every retelling. Some said it was a whole resort. Some said there was oil under the trees. No one knew the truth, but the idea of it was enough. 3 days after the meeting with Sam, someone knocked on my door in the middle of the afternoon. It was a soft knock, careful, the kind used by people who want to sound polite but still expect you to answer. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened the door. Emily stood on the porch in a cream coat, her hair perfect, her cheeks pink from the cold. She held a paper bag from the bakery downtown. The smell of cinnamon and sugar drifted up from it. Her smile was softer than I had ever seen it. She said she hoped she was not intruding. She said she wanted to talk to make things right after Christmas. Her voice carried a warmth that did not match the way her fingers clenched the handles of the bag. I stepped aside and let her in because some habits are hard to break. You open the door when family shows up, even when your gut tells you to be careful. She walked into the living room and placed the bag on the coffee table without taking off her coat. Her eyes went to Linda's chair by the fireplace, then to the pictures on the wall, then back to me. She seemed smaller in my house, less composed than in her own. She said she was sorry about what she said on Christmas. She said she had been under stress, end-of-year numbers at work, family pressure, too much wine, all the usual suspects. While she talked, her hands kept finding the edges of her pockets, fingers curling and uncurling, pulling the fabric tight against her sides. She smiled, but did not hold my eyes for long. Every time I looked at her, her gaze slid away to the window, to the photos, to the bag of pastries she had brought as a peace offering. I told her I appreciated the apology. The words felt stiff in my mouth, but I managed to say them. She relaxed a little at that, shoulders dropping half an inch. Then she started asking questions, gentle ones that circled around the same point. Had Sam explained everything clearly? Was the property very large? Had I thought about what I might do with it? Whether I planned to keep it or sell? Whether I had spoken with Michael about my plans? Each question was wrapped in concern, but the core of them was the same. I answered vaguely. Yes, I had spoken with the lawyer. No, I had not made any decisions. Yes, I planned to talk with my son. I did not give her details, and every time I did not, a shadow crossed her face, there then gone. While she was in mid-sentence, the phone rang in the kitchen. A landline, old and always a little too loud. I excused myself and went to answer. Emily stayed standing in the living room, tracing a pattern with her fingernail on the edge of the table. Sam's voice filled my ear. He asked if I had a moment. There was a weight in his tone that made me move farther into the kitchen, out of Emily's sight. He said he had been going over some of the records connected to Thomas's estate and my own background as a matter of routine. He said something unusual had come up on a credit report. Not mine. Michael's. Several consumer credit accounts opened in the last 2 years with high balances and missed payments. The applications listed my son's social security number and their home address, but the email and contact phone belonged to Emily. My hand tightened around the receiver. I asked if Michael knew. Sam said he could not say for sure, but from what he saw, it looked like someone had been using his information without his full involvement. Identity theft, he called it, when it happens between strangers. Inside a marriage, the word sits differently, but the damage is the same. I thanked him and hung up. The kitchen felt smaller. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded louder. When I walked back to the living room, Emily was looking at a picture of Michael at 15, taken the day he hit his first home run. Her expression was unreadable. I told her Michael should be here for this conversation and asked if she minded calling him. She hesitated, then said she would text. Her thumbs moved quickly over her phone. A few minutes later, she said he was on his way. We sat at the table with the untouched pastries between us. She tried to steer the talk back to Minnesota, to investments, to how it might be wise to let someone younger help manage the responsibilities so I would not be overwhelmed. Her voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. There was a thin edge beneath it now. The front door opened and closed. Michael's footsteps came down the hall. He appeared in the doorway, looking from her to me, reading the air, like a man walking into a room that smells faintly of smoke. He asked what was going on. Emily spoke first. She said she had come to apologize to me. She said we were discussing the property and making sure the family stayed on the same page. She reached for his hand as she spoke, but he did not move toward her. I looked at my son and saw the worry in his eyes, a familiar tightness around the mouth I had seen when he was little, afraid of something he could not name. I asked him if everything was all right with their finances. His body stiffened. He glanced at Emily. She gave the slightest shake of her head, barely there, but loud enough if you knew how to listen. He said things were fine, just the usual. Mortgage, daycare, car payments. Nothing unusual. His voice was too quick, too even. I told him Sam had called. I told him what the lawyer had found. I watched his face carefully as I spoke. At the mention of the accounts, his eyes closed for a fraction of a second, as if bracing for impact. He looked at Emily. There was no question in his eyes anymore, only confirmation. She said she had it under control. She said it was just some cards she had opened to get rewards points that she had planned to tell him when things settled. She talked fast, stringing explanations together, hoping one would sound plausible enough. He asked her how much. His voice was quiet. That scared me more than if he had shouted. She did not answer. The silence between them stretched. Finally, she muttered a number that was too high for any house like theirs to carry, without feeling it in the walls. His shoulders slumped. He sat down as if his legs could not hold him. I saw a man who had worked hard to build a life now realizing something had been eating away at its foundations while he was not looking. He said he had trusted her. The words came out barely above a whisper. She told him he was supposed to. She told him asking questions meant he did not believe in her. She told him if he loved her, he would let her handle things. I saw something else then beneath his anger and hurt. Fear. Not just fear of debt, of ruined credit, of legal trouble. Fear of being alone. Fear that if he pushed too hard she would leave and take the life he had wrapped around her with her. I felt it like a weight in my own chest. Men make mistakes for many reasons. Fear is one of the strongest. Emily stood up abruptly. She said she should go, that this conversation was clearly not headed anywhere good tonight. She said they could discuss it later when everyone was calmer. She grabbed her bag and moved toward the door. Michael did not try to stop her. The door closed with a soft thud. The house fell quiet again. Michael sat at the table with his head in his hands. I sat across from him, not reaching out yet, giving him the space to feel the hit. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. A text from Jack. He and I had worked the same jobs on different sites over the years, and after he retired from the sheriff's department, he made a habit of checking in when he thought I might need it. I had called him the night before from the kitchen table, told him about the will, about Emily's sudden interest, about the feeling in my gut that something more was going on. You need to protect yourself, he had said. And Michael, if she is in deep, there will be paper somewhere. People like that always leave a trail they think no one will follow. Check where she thinks no one is looking. Trash is honest. Now his message was short. Just a question asking if I had talked to my son. I slid the phone back into my pocket. I told Michael we would figure things out, but we needed to see clearly first. I did not lecture him. There was nothing I could say he had not already said to himself twice over. Later that night, after I drove him home and watched him walk into his house under a porch light that suddenly felt too bright, I sat in my truck at the curb and let the engine idle. The windows fogged at the edges. In the side yard, the garbage bin stood near the fence lid, half closed, snow pressed against its base. Jack's words circled in my mind. Trash is honest. I stepped out into the cold breath rising in clouds. I moved quietly along the side of the house, my boots crunching softly in the packed snow. The bin was heavier than it looked when I lifted the lid. Inside, black bags filled the space. One near the top was not tied tightly. White paper peeked through the gap. I pulled it out and knelt beside it. The wind cut through my coat, but I barely felt it. My fingers dug through junk mail, store receipts, torn envelopes. Near the middle, I found a stack of paper that had been ripped in half once, then crumpled, but not shredded. I smoothed the pieces against my knee under the weak light from the kitchen window. The heading at the top carried the name of a financial institution I recognized. Transfer of ownership. My name. Michael's name. The description of real property. The signatures at the bottom. One was mine. Or it was meant to be. The curve of the E was too slow. The line through the D was too neat. My hand had never made that mark in my life. The wind picked up and tugged at the edges of the papers. I held them tighter, feeling the weight of more than ink. I did not say anything. There was no one there to hear it. I folded the pieces together, placed them inside my coat, lowered the lid of the bin, and walked back toward the truck. The house behind me glowed with warm light through the curtains. Inside, my son moved through rooms he thought were safe. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment, the torn contract on the seat beside me, the cold working its way into my bones, and the quiet knowledge settling in that whatever this had become, it was no longer just about hurt feelings at a Christmas table. The coffee shop by the lake still smelled like burnt espresso and fried eggs, the way it had the first time I brought Michael there when he was 12. Back then, we came in soaked from the rain after a failed morning of fishing, laughing, as we dripped on the floor, proud of the one small perch we did not even keep. Now the winter light fell flat through the big front windows, and the only sound was the soft clink of ceramic and the low murmur of a radio near the counter. I chose a table by the window, the one where you could see the frozen surface of the lake through a gap between two warehouses. The ice was covered in snow, a white sheet broken only by a few dark patches where the wind had swept it clean. I set the folded pages on the table in front of me, the forged transfer on top, the printout from Sam underneath. The paper looked thin in the morning light, but it felt heavy. Michael came in a few minutes late, shoulders hunched against the cold. He scanned the room, saw me, and lifted his hand in a small wave. There were shadows under his eyes that had not been there a month ago. He sat down and looked at the stack of paper before he looked at me. He asked if everything was all right. The question sounded automatic, like the first line of a script. I slid the top page toward him without answering. The contract lay between us, torn edges lined up as best as I could manage. For a moment, he just stared at it, as if waiting for the letters to rearrange themselves into something kinder. He picked it up. His eyes moved over the heading, the description of the property, the names. When he reached the signatures, his hand began to shake. I watched him trace the line where my name was written, the familiar letters made strange by someone who had only seen them from across a table. "This is your signature," he said, though it came out more like a question. I told him no. I told him my hand had never drawn that line. He studied it again, slower this time. I could see the moment his mind stopped trying to explain it away. His shoulders sagged and he set the page down as if it hurt to hold. He asked where I found it. I told him about the trash bin, about Jack, about Sam's call. I kept my voice even, but inside every word felt like pushing a nail through wood. He did not defend her, not right away. He did not accuse her either. He sat there with his thumb pressing the edge of the paper, like he could hold it all in place if he just pushed hard enough. The silence between us filled with the sound of the espresso machine hissing and the scrape of a chair on tile somewhere behind him. He finally looked up at me. There was anger in his eyes, but it was not pointed yet. It was a storm still deciding where to break. He asked if I was sure. He asked if there was any chance Sam had misunderstood, any chance the accounts were not what they looked like. I did not blame him for wanting a crack in the wall wide enough to crawl through. I reached into my coat and took out the second set of papers, the ones Sam had sent. Account histories, application forms, balances. I pushed them across the table. "These," I said, "are in your name, and these email addresses belong to Emily." He went quiet again. There is a kind of silence that happens in a man when the story he has been telling himself no longer fits the facts in front of him. You can see it in his face like a slow breaking. I told him I was not there to tell him what to do. I said I needed him to see what I had seen, to know that if he felt something was wrong, he was not crazy. The words came out halting, but they were the only ones I had. For a long moment, he seemed lost, his gaze moving from the papers to the window to the coffee in front of him, untouched and cooling. He said he had felt something off for months. Little things, a new card in her wallet, a bill she did not want him to open. Late notices she shrugged off as mistakes. He said every time he asked, she told him he did not trust her enough, that questioning her meant he did not understand what it took to keep their life afloat. He laughed once short and without humor. "I thought I was being a good husband," he said. "I thought giving her the benefit of the doubt was what I was supposed to do." I told him, "Trust is not the same as blindness." He nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the table. I could see that he heard me, but I knew the real conversation he needed to have was not with me. He asked if I would come to the house. His voice shook a little. I realized then he did not want to walk back into that fire alone. When we pulled into his driveway, Emily's car was already there. The lights in the living room glowed against the gray afternoon. As we approached the door, it opened before Michael could reach for the handle. Emily stood there, one hand on the knob, the other holding her phone. Her expression when she saw the papers in his hand told me she already knew something had shifted. "What is this?" she asked, eyes moving between us. He did not answer her on the threshold. He stepped past her into the house and told her they needed to talk. His tone was quieter than I had ever heard it in conflict, and that alone made her straighten. In the living room, Emily's parents sat on the sofa coats, still on a half-finished cup of coffee on the table in front of them. They looked up as we entered, surprise flickering across their faces when they saw me. Craig asked if everything was all right. His voice sounded polite and wary in equal measure. Michael did not sit. He stood near the coffee table and laid the forged contract down where everyone could see it. The papers from Sam went beside it. Emily stayed near the doorway for a second, then came closer. He told her he wanted to hear from her how his name had ended up on accounts he had never signed, for why there was a transfer document for my property with a fake version of my signature on it in their trash. She tried to laugh it off at first, said there must be some mix-up, that we were overreacting, that maybe the bank had made a mistake. The excuses came faster than she could shape them. He cut through them with 2 words. "Answer me." She stopped. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. She looked at her parents seeking backup, and found it in their gaze. Her mother spoke first. She said I had always been suspicious of their side of the family, that I never liked the fact that Emily came from money, that I was using this as a way to hang on to the inheritance from Thomas. Her father added that old people sometimes got confused about what they had signed, that it would be easy to misremember. Michael's jaw clenched. He looked at me, then back at them. "Dad does not forget his own signature," he said, "and he did not forget who helped him buy this house." The room went quiet again. Emily's eyes flashed. "So you are just going to take his side," she said, "after everything I have done to keep this family together, after all the pressure I am under. You would believe a man who has nothing over your own wife." The word nothing hung there, familiar, sharp. It took me back to the Christmas table for a heartbeat, but this time it did not land the same way. Michael took a breath, then another. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "I am believing the paper," he said. "I am believing the accounts I never opened. I am believing the debt I did not know about. And I am believing that my father would not sit here and lie to my face." She searched his face for a sign that he was bluffing, that he would back down if she pushed hard enough. When she did not find it, something hardened in her expression. She said this was all about control, that I had never accepted her, that I could not stand the idea of them building a life without my input. She said I was trying to poison her husband against her before the cabin and the land were divided. Her parents nodded along, throwing in small comments calling me stubborn, old-fashioned, selfish. The words were not what stung. It was the fact that my son had to stand there and listen to them talk about his father as if I were not in the room. I felt heat rise in my chest, the urge to defend myself, to fire back. Instead, I opened my coat and placed one more paper on the table, a printout of the credit report Sam had pulled. "Numbers do not care who you believe. They just sit where they are placed. Emily glanced down at it, and in that split second before she looked away, everything showed. Panic, calculation, anger. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. Michael picked up the report. He traced the dates with his fingertip. "These are from last year," he said. "The same time you told me we did not have anything to worry about. The same time you told me to stop asking questions." She took a step toward him, reached for his arm. He moved away. I watched the boy who had once held my hand, crossing icy sidewalks, now holding his ground in his own living room. It was not the way I wanted to see him grow up, but it was growth all the same. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said the sentence I never thought I would hear in that house. "I trust my father." The words landed in the room like a heavy object dropped into water, sending ripples in every direction. Emily recoiled as if she had been slapped. Her parents made small sounds of protest, but they were background now. She stared at him, eyes bright with anger. "Fine," she said. "If that is how it is, have your little alliance. I hope the two of you are happy together." She turned and walked down the hall. A door slammed a moment later, the sound echoing through the walls. Michael stayed where he was, breathing hard. His shoulders shook once, then stilled. No one spoke. Even the refrigerator in the kitchen seemed to hold its hum for a moment. I did not touch him. I did not tell him he had done the right thing. Those are words you save for later, when the dust has settled and a man can hear them. Outside, a plow passed by, its metal blade scraping along the street, loud and distant. The house shivered faintly in its wake, the windows rattling in their frames, as if the whole structure were adjusting to a new shape it had not chosen. The sound of the plow faded as I walked down Michael's front steps and out to the street. The air was sharp enough to sting my lungs. I stood there for a moment with my hand on the truck door, looking back at the house. Light glowed in the front window, warm and steady, but I knew the ground inside had shifted in a way none of us could ignore. On the drive home, the world outside the windshield blurred into gray and white. Tire tracks cut dark lines through the snow on the highway. I kept one hand on the wheel and the other on my coat pocket where the torn contract rested. The paper crinkled slightly with each turn. It felt less like a document and more like a piece of shrapnel that needed to be removed before the wound could heal. I did not sleep much that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope from Brainerd and the papers from Sam spread out in front of me. The clock on the wall clicked off the seconds. The furnace kicked on and off. Somewhere after midnight, I picked up the phone and called Jack. He answered on the third ring, voice rough with sleep, but alert in that way men get after years of being on call. "Everything all right?" he asked. I told him about the confrontation, about Michael finally saying he trusted me, about Emily, the forged signature, the debt. I kept it simple. Jack filled in the rest on his own. He was quiet for a long moment. I could hear ice clinking in a glass on his end of the line. "You got to protect the kid," he said. "And I do not mean your son, I mean the little one. Lucas. He did not choose any of this." I said that was what scared me most. The idea that all of this could land on a 4-year-old someday wrapped in paperwork and resentment. "You cannot control what she does," Jack said, "or what Michael does next. But you can control what you leave behind. Put it in writing. Make it so clear no one can twist it when you are not here to argue." The word writing settled in my chest. I looked at the will documents on the table, the black and white of Thomas's last decisions, the weight they carried. I asked Jack if he thought I was being vindictive, if cutting Emily out would make me the same kind of person she believed I already was. He snorted softly. "There is a difference between revenge and keeping a loaded gun out of a child's hands," he said. "You know which side you are on. Just make sure a judge would agree." The next day, I drove back to Sam's office. The sky over Appleton was the color of metal, and the streets were lined with dirty snow. I walked up the stairs to the second floor and felt each step in my knees. Sam greeted me with a nod and a tired smile. He had a file already open on his desk when I sat down. "You want to make some changes," he said. It was not a question. I told him I wanted a new will drawn up. Everything I had from Thomas, the cabin, the land, whatever money was attached, all of it to go to my grandson, to Lucas. No one else. Sam listened without interrupting. His pen rested on the legal pad in front of him, tip touching the paper, but not moving yet. I told him Michael could serve as trustee. Someone would need to handle the details until the boy came of age, but I wanted oversight. Court review for any sale or loan tied to the property. Clear language that no spouse present or future could claim ownership or use the land as collateral without approval. When I said Emily's name, Sam did not write it down. He knew enough to understand how to handle that part. He just nodded, eyes steady. "We can create a testamentary trust," he said. "It will spring into being when you pass. Until then, you keep control. After that, the terms are locked." Judges tend to respect the wishes of someone who took the time to be specific. I asked him if what I was doing would stand up. If someone like Emily, angry and motivated, could challenge it. "Anyone can file a challenge," he said. "But from what you have told me and from what I have seen, your concerns are reasonable. You are not cutting her out of spite. You are protecting a minor from documented financial risk." He paused, then added that it might not feel good even if it was the right thing. The law could not fix hurt feelings. He spent the next half hour reading language from a draft he typed as we talked. It was standard in structure, but the content hit me in the gut. Lucas's name on the page, references to his guardianship, contingencies if something happened to Michael, the cold planning of a world where I was gone and so was my son, and a boy I loved stood alone with only paper to speak for him. When he was done, he slid the draft across the desk. I read every line. My eyes caught on one section where Emily's name appeared only to state that she was to have no claim or authority. It was one sentence, simple and clear. It felt heavier than the rest. Sam watched my face. "You sure about this?" he asked. I thought about Christmas night, about the forged signature, about Michael's shoulders shaking in my kitchen, about Lucas sitting on the floor with his toy truck, unaware of the storm building over his head. "Yes," I said. "I am sure." We scheduled a time for me to come back and sign with witnesses. As I stood to leave, Sam gave one more piece of advice. "Document everything," he said. "Keep copies of what you found, notes of conversations. If this ever ends up in court, memory will not be enough." I told him I understood. Years in carpentry had taught me that what you do not write down will come back to haunt you. On the way home, I stopped at Jack's place. His house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a small flag flapping in the yard. He opened the door with a mug in his hand, and a look that said he already knew why I was there. We sat at his kitchen table, the same kind of table thousands of men in towns like ours had sat at to talk about things they could not say anywhere else. I laid out the papers, the new draft of the will, the forged contract, the credit report. Jack read them in silence, his jaw tightening as he moved from one page to the next. He tapped the fake signature with his finger. "She went this far," he said. "She will go further if you let her. You are doing the right thing." I told him it did not feel like anything noble. It felt like closing doors. He shrugged. "Sometimes closing a door is the only way to keep a house standing," he said. We talked for a while longer. Practical things. What to watch for. How to respond if Emily tried to contact me about money again. When I left, the sun was already dipping behind the houses, turning the snow in his yard a soft blue. That night at my own kitchen table, I wrote a letter to my son. The pen felt awkward in my hand. I was more used to pencils and tape measures than to putting feelings on paper. Still, the words came. I told him I had updated my will. I told him everything from Thomas would go to Lucas someday. I told him this was not a punishment for him and not a way to hurt Emily. It was my attempt to give his son a piece of land and a future that were not tangled up in anyone else's mistakes. I told him I believed he could stand on his own feet even if life was rougher, without the illusions he had carried. I wrote that I loved him. I did not dress it up. I folded the letter and slid it into an envelope along with a copy of the new draft from Sam. I wrote his name on the front and set it in the middle of the table where I could not miss it in the morning. When I turned off the lights, the house fell into its usual winter quiet. The furnace hummed, the old pipes creaked once, then settled. In the dim glow from the street lamp outside, I could still see the shape of the envelope on the table, a small, pale rectangle against the dark wood. I stood there for a moment longer. The letter between us, in the half-light, knowing that when the sun came up and he opened it, nothing about our family would look quite the same again. In the morning, the envelope was gone from the table. A coffee ring marked the place where it had been. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles after a decision has already been made. Light from the kitchen window fell across the wood in a pale stripe. Outside, the street was still half asleep under old snow. For a while, nothing changed, at least nothing that could be seen from the outside. Michael went to work. Emily went on pretending the world had tilted in her favor. I went back to the small jobs that kept my hands busy, and my mind from circling the same questions too many times. Winter in Wisconsin is good for that. Snow to shovel pipes, to check fences, to mend. Then the calls started. Sam let me know that the bank had flagged some of the accounts. Their fraud department asked questions. The fake transfer on my property pulled more attention than Emily had planned. A detective from the sheriff office called me about the signature. His tone was respectful but firm. He asked if I had signed anything related to the Minnesota land. I told him no. He asked if I was willing to provide a sample of my signature. I told him yes. A week later, Michael came by with a printout of emails he had found on their shared laptop. Messages between Emily and a friend talking about balance transfers and credit limits and the property up north like it was already theirs. There was a thread about the contract in the trash, her annoyance that she had been careless with the disposal. Reading the words made my chest feel tight, not because of the crime in them, but because of the casual way she spoke about bending everything to her advantage. The day Emily left, there was no shouting that I heard, no slammed doors on my street. I only knew it had happened because Michael called near dusk. His voice sounded thin. He said she had packed a suitcase and driven off while Lucas was at daycare. She had left behind a trail of unpaid bills, a letter on the counter about needing space and the rest of the mess for him to sort out. Her parents stopped returning his calls. The law would find her sooner or later. That part was out of our hands. The night he broke was a Tuesday. I was half asleep in my chair when someone knocked hard on the front door. The clock in the hall showed a late hour, the kind when the only people who visit are lost or in trouble. I opened the door, and there he was, shoulders hunched, eyes red, his winter coat half-zipped, breath clouding in the cold. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. His hands shook as he took off his gloves. He could barely get words out at first. When he did, they came out flat. He said he did not know who he had become. He sat at my kitchen table in the same chair he used as a teen when he would come home late from practice and eat whatever leftovers were in the fridge. Only now there was no hunger, just a hollow space where his confidence had been. He stared at his hands like they belonged to someone else. I made coffee because sometimes a man needs something to hold. The steam rose between us. The old clock ticked. Snow tapped the window in small bursts from the wind. He told me everything. The calls from the bank, the messages from the detective, the last argument with Emily when the evidence had cornered her. The way she had looked at him like he was an obstacle, not a partner. The way she had left without turning back. He kept circling the same sentence. He said he should have seen it. He said a better man would have seen it. He called himself weak, blind, a fool. Words I recognized because I had used them on myself in different seasons of my own life. I let him talk until the words ran out. Then I sat there with him, letting the silence be a kind of bandage. Sometimes that is the only thing that keeps the bleeding from getting worse. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded older than I felt. I told him a man is not measured by how many times he is knocked down. He is measured by the direction he faces when he stands up. I told him that shame is loud at first, but it does not have to be permanent. He listened, eyes fixed on some point beyond my shoulder, like he was trying to picture a version of himself he could live with. We did not solve anything that night. No plans, no lists, no big promises. At the end of it, he was just a son sleeping on my couch, one arm flung over his face, breathing heavy from exhaustion. I stood in the doorway a while, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, and thought about all the nights I had stood in that spot when he was small. Some things repeat whether we expect them to or not. A few days later, I suggested we go north. The idea came while I was staring at the papers from Thomas the Deed, with its lines and measurements, the map with the lake marked in pale blue. The cabin had been just a set of words on a page for years. Maybe it was time to make it into a place again. We loaded the truck on a cold Saturday morning. A couple of toolboxes, extra blankets, groceries in paper bags. Lucas sat in the back seat in his car seat boots, clutching a small plastic truck in one hand. He did not understand why we were going, only that he was riding in Grandpa truck, and that alone was enough to make him smile. The highway north felt different this time, less like a road to a stranger funeral, and more like a path towards something open. The land widened as we drove farm fields, giving way to long stretches of forest. Patches of sky showed through bare branches. The closer we got to Brainerd, the quieter the world felt. The cabin looked almost the same as it had the day I first saw it after Thomas died. Snow on the roof, shutters hanging a little crooked. The lake behind it frozen over a flat mirror under a pale sky. This time, though, there was smoke when we lit the wood stove. There were footsteps on the porch. There were voices inside. We spent the first hours working. Work is easier than thinking. Michael and I walked the perimeter of the small property, checking fences. A few posts leaned at odd angles. We straightened them, packed fresh snow and dirt around their bases, wrapped new wire where the old had sagged. Lucas followed us, leaving small boot prints in our larger ones, stopping now and then to scoop up handfuls of powder and toss it into the air. Inside the cabin smelled like dry wood and the faint trace of whatever Thomas had cooked there last. Dust lay on the shelves. The dishes in the cupboard were old but clean. I ran my hand along the edge of the table in the main room. I could picture Tom sitting there alone year after year, holding his coffee and looking out at the lake. We lit a fire in the stone fireplace. The crackle of the logs filled the room with a soft noise that felt like company. Lucas sat on the rug with his truck and a line of pine cones he had collected outside. He rolled the tires over the rough edges and hummed to himself. As the day faded, the light outside shifted from white to gold. We stepped onto the small dock at the edge of the property. The ice stretched out in front of us, clean and wide. The sun sat low above the tree line, throwing long shadows across the snow. The air was cold enough to sting, but not enough to drive us back inside. Michael stood beside me, hands deep in his pockets, shoulders slightly forward. His breath drifted in faint clouds. For a while, we just looked out at the lake the way men do when there are too many words and no good place to start. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. He said he was sorry. Not in the loud way people apologize when they want to be seen doing it. In a quiet way, like the words had been sitting in his chest for a long time and had just now found a way out. He said he was sorry for not listening earlier. Sorry for the times he had chosen comfort over truth. Sorry for letting another person tell him who his father was. I turned to look at him. His eyes were fixed on the horizon. He looked younger and older at the same time. I told him I had forgiven him long before he asked. That none of this was about me needing an apology. What I needed, what I had always needed, was for him to understand the cost of honesty and to choose it anyway. The wind carried some of the words away, but the ones that stayed seemed to land. He nodded. His shoulders eased a little. For the first time in a long time, I saw a line from the boy he had been to the man beside me that did not feel broken. Behind us, Lucas ran in small circles in the snow near the cabin, his cheeks red, his laughter cutting clear through the cold air. He held a stick like a sword, chasing shadows only he could see. Every so often he would look up to make sure we were still there, then go back to his game. Watching him under that fading light, it struck me how wrong I had been when I answered Emily on Christmas. She had asked what I had. I had said nothing. Looking at my grandson on that patch of land my wife-brother had left behind, at my son standing beside me instead of across from me, the word no longer fit. We walked back toward the cabin as the sun slipped behind the trees. The first stars appeared faint and patient. Inside, the fire cast a warm glow over the walls. Lucas curled up in a blanket near the hearth, eyes heavy, hair still damp from where snow had melted and run down his neck. Michael set another log on the fire. Sparks rose, then settled. The cabin creaked softly in the cold wood, adjusting to the weight of another winter. I sat in the old chair by the window and watched the last light fade from the lake. For the first time in a long time, the quiet around me did not feel like an empty space. It felt like a pause between one breath and the next,